They called it her walking Thanksgiving, and they set it to her face at the Two Rivers elevator the morning she came in for a load of oat screenings. The whole platform of men grinning while Cyrus Dwight asked, loud enough for the scale house, whether Alta Renfrew had finally decided to run all 117 of the gobbling things through the plucker and put the feed into hogs like a person with sense. The platform laughed. Alta set her money on the counter and said she believed she would keep the birds a while longer, and she carried her sacks out to the truck with her back straight and her ears burning, and behind her the laughter had that particular Ring Valley men keep for a widow who will not take good advice. She was 45 years old that summer, the summer of 1954, and she had been a widow for 4 of those years, and she farmed a hardscrabble quarter section out at the dry end of the Dry Cedar country, where the topsoil ran thin over caliche and the draws crept in dry and brushy along every field, and the good families down on the bottom ground had always privately agreed that a woman alone could not hold it. Harlan Renfrew had died in the winter of a lung that filled up on him in the space of a bad week, and after the funeral the valley had been kind to Alta in the way people are kind about a place they are quietly certain will be for sale inside 2 years. They brought hot dishes. They mentioned gently that Cyrus Dwight was always looking to add ground, and that there was no shame in a fair price. Alta thanked them for the food, and she did not sell, and within a year she had done the thing that turned the valley's pity into open ridicule. She had raised up, off a few cheap poults and a borrowed broody hen, a drove of 117 bronze turkeys. The birds had a reputation, and the reputation was that they were foolishness on legs. Everyone in the Dry Cedar country knew what a turkey was and what a turkey was good for, which was to say one thing in November and nothing at all the rest of the year. They were big, gawky, coppery birds with ball blue and red heads and a way of walking that looked like an argument, and they ate, Lord, how they ate, more grain by the head than a laying hen, and with none of the eggs to show for it, and they fouled the yard, and they went strange in weather, and worst of all, past every other sin, they gobbled. A drove of turkeys did not cluck or settle the comfortable barnyard way a pen of hens did. It gobbled, a loose, rolling, foolish racket, 100 throats answering each other at a clap of thunder, at a slammed truck door, at a hawk crossing the sun, at nothing on God's earth at all. The men at the elevator agreed that if a person had set out on purpose to design the single most wasteful creature a dry land farmer could keep, they could not have improved on a turkey, and that only a woman gone soft with grief would feel a whole quarter section with the gobbling things 11 months out of the year. Alta Renfrew was not, by the reckoning of the men on the elevator steps, the sort of person anyone expected to know better. She was a spare, weathered woman with sun lines at her eyes and graying dark hair she kept tucked up under a faded straw sun hat, quiet by nature and quieter since Harlan died, and she had never in her life been one to argue a point on a loading platform. She kept to her place. She did her own fencing and her own cutting and drilled her own wheat and kept a garden that fed her through the winter, and she read the almanac, the extension circulars, the old field notes Harlan's people had kept in a coffee can on the porch, and she trusted a thing she had watched with her own eyes over a thing a platform full of men agreed was true. That habit was about to make her the most laughed-at woman in the valley, and then, though not one of the men grinning at the elevator that morning would have believed it, the one they all came to. What none of them troubled to ask was why. Not one man on that platform, in all the weeks of easy laughter, ever thought to ask Alta Renfrew why a careful woman who counted every bushel and would not waste a handful of grain would go out of her way to raise up 117 birds that everyone knew ate their heads off 11 months of 12? They did not ask because they were certain they already knew the answer. And the answer was that grief had made her foolish. But Alta had a reason, and the reason was a thing she had watched happen years before, on this very ground, with her own 2 eyes. It had been Harlan who first brought the notion home, back before he died, off an old Mormon freighter named Orrin Buckle, who had hauled through the Dry Cedar country in the wagon days and stopped a season to help them put up a barn. Orrin had grown up down in the Utah settlements, and he had told Harlan, in the flat, certain way of a man passing on something his own people had learned the hard way, that when the crickets and the hoppers came down on the Utah fields in the early years, there was one thing besides prayer that ever turned the tide, and it was birds, gulls, when the Lord sent them, and turkeys when a man had the sense to keep a drove, for a turkey would walk a field all day eating hoppers till its crop bulged and never touch the standing grain if the hoppers were there to be had. Harlan had half laughed at first, the way a wheat man laughs at a freighter's yarns. But Orrin had not been spinning a yarn. That fall, Harlan kept back a dozen poults out of curiosity, and the next dry summer, when the hoppers came thin into the oat piece, Alta had watched the small drove work the ages of that field like hired hands, and had seen with her own eyes the thing no circular had ever quite made her believe. Where the turkeys walked, the hoppers were gone, and the grain stood clean. She remembered the way Orrin had said it, because he had not said it the way a man sells you a thing. He had said it the way a man tells you the plain shape of the world and does not much care whether you believe him. They had been eating their noon dinner in the shade of the half-raised barn, the 3 of them, and Harlan had been complaining about the hoppers the way every man in the country complained about the hoppers, as a fixed and hopeless judgment out of the dry draws, like the wind. And Orrin had set down his cup and said that where he came from the folks did not stand and watch a field go. They turned loose everything with a beak on it, and that a turkey was worth 10 hired boys with a drag sack, because a turkey never tired and never quit, and worked for its own belly's sake from first light to dark. Harlan had asked, half-joking, whether he meant to say a drove of gobblers could do what Poison Bran and Fire Guard could not, and Orrin had said he did not mean to say it. He meant it was so, and that Harlan could believe it or watch his oats go the next bad year. It was all one to him. There had been no heat in it. It was the certainty of a man who has watched a thing be true so long that other men's doubt has stopped being interesting. And when Orrin loaded up and hauled on at the end of the season, the notion he had planted stayed. And the dozen poults Harlan kept back proved him right, and Alta never forgot the flat, sure sound of a man passing on a thing worth more than he was ever paid for. So it was not, whatever the valley believed, a thing Alta had dreamed up out of grief. It was a thing she had inherited twice over, once from an old freighter's people by way of a noon dinner in the shade, and once from watching a dozen birds hold the hoppers off her husband's oats before ever the valley thought to laugh. She had tested it the way she tested everything, not by arguing it, but by watching it, year on year, until the watching left no room for doubt. She knew which of her neighbors burned poisoned bran along their fence rows every dry July and still lost the heads off their wheat. And she knew that on her own thin caliche ground, the ground the valley pitied, a bad hopper year came, and went and left her grain standing. A dozen birds had done that on the Renfrew place. She had 117 now, raised up on purpose over 4 patient years, off cheap poults and set eggs and a borrowed hen. She did not need a circular or a county man or a single word of anyone's blessing to know what 117 would do, and she did not much care that the valley thought her a fool for knowing it, because she had learned long since that being thought a fool by people who have not watched what you have watched is a cheap enough price for being right. The valley found out, because valleys always find out, and the valley laughed. Word went round the elevator and the church steps and the co-op scale within a season that the Renfrew widow had gone and raised up better than 100 of the gobbling things, a whole quarter section of them now, and the country settled in to enjoy it. They could hear the drove from the section road, they said, that foolish rolling racket carrying on a still morning. And they pitied her nearest neighbors, and they marveled that a grown woman would do such a thing on purpose. Cyrus Dwight, who ran the best half section of bottom wheat in the valley and ran the country's opinions besides, allowed to the whole elevator that he'd offered the widow a fair price for that ground twice over and been turned down flat, and that now she'd filled it with gobbling stock that ate their heads off and laid nothing, and that he supposed a person got the farm they deserved. The men laughed. Not one of them asked the only question that mattered, which was what a woman who had watched a drove of turkeys hold the hoppers off her ground might know that a platform full of men who had never watched anything of the kind did not. The mockery had a face, and the face was the elevator, and Alta met it the only way she knew, which was to go in for what she needed and come out again without giving them the satisfaction of an argument. She heard it stop when the door of the scale house opened and start again lower, the way talk does when its subject walks in. One of the older men turned on the bench that first season and asked her, for the pleasure of the room, whether she was raising them birds for the meat or the music, because he couldn't rightly tell which they were worse at. The room laughed. Alta said she was raising them for neither, and left it there, and paid for her screenings, and went out, and behind her the laughter had a slightly puzzled edge under it that it had not had going in, because a person who will not defend a foolish thing is harder to laugh at than a person who will. She had learned in 4 years of being a widow the valley expected to fail, that there is a particular loneliness in being the only one on a place who knows what the place needs. She did not enjoy it. She had simply stopped expecting company in it. So when the Pruitt family down the road went broke the slow way and quit the country for a wage job in town, and had a broody hen and a clutch of bronze poults they could not carry to a rented room, Alta Renfrew did the thing that first set the valley to laughing. She took the birds for almost nothing, a couple of dollars and a jar of her choke cherry. And she carried them home in a nail keg lined with gunny sacking, and she set herself to raising up the biggest turkey drove the Dry Cedar country had ever seen, not for the table, not for November, but to walk her fields against the hoppers the way a dozen had once walked Harlan's oats. She was not keeping a holiday flock. She was not soft with grief. She was, quietly and on purpose, raising an army against a plague she knew came around as sure as the dry years did, and she was raising it out of birds the rest of the valley would have run through a plucker without a second thought. The 4 years of the raising stayed with her. In the plain way patient work stays with a person who has done a great deal of it alone. A turkey poult is a fragile, foolish thing its first weeks, prone to chill and damp and to standing in the rain with its face turned up until it drowns on its feet, and Alta lost her share the first spring and learned, the way she learned everything, by doing it wrong once and not twice. She brooded them close under the borrowed hen and then under lamps in a corner of the machine shed. And she doctored them and dried them and stood over them, and she culled hard and set eggs harder, and every year the drove that walked out onto her stubble in the fall was bigger than the year before. By the summer of 1954, it stood at 117 head, big bronze birds that knew her voice and her feed bucket and knew the boundaries of her ground the way a good dog knows a yard, and spent the long days of that dry summer strung out across her fields in a loose working line, heads down, doing the one thing on earth a turkey does better than any creature living. There was a craft to holding a drove that big to the fields, and Alta had it now, 4 years deep. A turkey will range wide and will drift if a body lets it, up the draw and into the neighbor's stubble and gone, so through the working months she fed a little grain at the yard at dusk, the same call every evening, teaching 117 birds that home was the place the bucket was, and the roost poles in the shed lot were the place to settle when the light went. So that they walked wide all the long day over every field she needed patrolled and came drifting back at dark of their own accord, gobbling to be shut in against the coyotes and the owls. She counted them every night. It became a thing she did the way another woman might say her prayers, standing at the shed lot in the last of the light while the drove came filing in off the darkening fields, counting the coppery shapes up onto the poles, a habit that would matter more than she knew before the summer was out. Because a woman who counts her drove every night is a woman who knows, to the bird, that her ground is being covered. She watched them work, too, in the evenings, the way some people watch weather. She would stand at the field edge with the day's heat going out of the ground and follow the working line of them across the wheat and the oat piece, the drove spread wide and busy, heads dipping, and she could see, if you knew to look, the pattern of it, how they favored the crop edges and the draw margins, and the grassy fence rows where the hoppers hatched and staged, and worked those hardest, and moved down the drilled rows without ever tearing at the standing heads so long as there was a hopper to be had. She had watched a big drove empty its crops of nothing but hoppers, watched a bird's crawl bulge tight by mid-morning in a bad hatch, and she knew a thing the poison brand men did not, that a turkey does not merely nibble the edge of a plague, it patrols against it all day, for its own greedy belly's sake, and never sends a bill. She did not tell anyone. There was no one to tell who would have heard it. But she saw it, and she filed it away with 4 years of the same, and she went on holding her gobbling army to the fields while the valley laughed and burned its brand and waited, though none of them knew they were waiting, for the thing that was already breeding up thick in every dry draw in the country. There was a neighbor's oat piece she watched that summer without meaning to, a lease field of the Halvorsons that lay just across the line fence from her own, and it taught her more than any circular could have about the difference her birds made. The Halvorsen oats and her own wheat came up out of the same thin ground under the same dry sky, and the same hoppers hatched in the same draw that ran between them, and there the sameness ended. Where her drove worked, the crop edge stood clean and green, and the stems carried their heads across the fence, where no bird had ever set a foot. The same draw sent its hoppers up into the oats unopposed, and by late July she could stand at her own fence and see the two fields side by side like a lesson drawn on purpose, hers holding, theirs going thin and ragged at the margin, and not a soul in the valley but her to read what the fence line was plainly saying. She thought once of walking over and telling them. She did not, because she knew how it would land, a widow with a yard full of gobblers come to lecture a man on his own oats, and she had long since made her peace with the plain hard fact that a thing seen is not a thing that can be given to a person who has decided not to look. For she had come over the years to hear the gobbling differently than the rest of the valley did. To Cyrus Dwight and the men on the elevator steps, the turkey racket was simply the worst thing about an already wasteful bird, a foolish noise carried on the wind off a foolish woman's place. But Alta had learned to read it. She knew that a steady rolling chorus out along the draw meant the drove was working the worst of the hopper ground. She knew that a sudden hard swell of it meant a hawk was over, or a coyote was moving the fence line, or a stranger's truck had turned in off the road, and that her birds would give her that word a full minute before she'd have known any other way. The sound the whole valley mocked her for was to her ear at once a work song and a watch bell, the plain audible proof that 117 tireless mouths were out patrolling every field she owned. She had stopped hearing it as noise a long time ago. She heard it as safety and as bread in the bin come winter. And by the end of that terrible summer, so would they. The land answered the way worked ground answers. Through the early summer of 1954, the Dry Cedar country baked under a sky that gave nothing. Week on week of hard blue heat, with the wheat heading short and the topsoil smoking off the fallow in the afternoon wind, and out in the draws, in the curled dead grass, the grasshoppers hatched. They hatched everywhere that dry spring hatches them. In the fence rows and the ditch banks and the untilled draw bottoms, tiny at first and unremarked, the way a plague always begins as a nuisance. The valley saw them and thought little of it. There were always hoppers in a dry year. A man burned a little poison bran along his margins and cursed the weather and got on with his cutting, the way people do about a thing that has always been a nuisance and never yet been worse. That was the summer the valley learned different. On Alta Renfrew's quarter section, that same early summer, the hoppers hatched too, and were eaten as fast as they hatched. Where 117 bronze turkeys patrolled the crop edges and the draw margins from first light to dark. The young hoppers could not stage and could not build. They were snapped off the dead grass before they could harden a wing, stripped out of the fence rows before they could mass, worked down day after day by a drove that never tired and never quit, and Alta's fields, alone in all that country, carried through the killing early summer with a hopper load held down to nothing. She could walk her wheat in the July heat and flush hardly a bird-sized jump ahead of her boot, could stand at her oat piece of an evening and hear the drove gobbling contentedly over the draw where any other man's draw was singing with wings, and she knew, with the quiet certainty of a woman who had watched it 4 years running, that her ground was clean and standing while the country around her had let the thing breed up unchecked, and the rest of the valley that same summer was doing the opposite. Up and down the good bottom ground and along the section roads and through all the wide dry land wheat of the well-run places, the hoppers bred up out of the draws with nothing to hold them, no drove, no bird. Nothing but a little poison bran a hard wind blew off the margins by noon. By late July there were hoppers on every fence post and hoppers in every ditch, and men stood at their field edges of an evening watching the draws move and told each other it was a bad year and would want watching, and drove to the elevator and said as much, and did not, any of them, keep a single turkey against it. The hoppers were only hoppers. Everyone knew a hopper was a nuisance and nothing more. And then, in the first week of August, in the killing heat, the draws emptied all at once, and the valley learned what a plague is. It came the way these things come, without a bell, on a hot, still morning that turned the light strange. A man on the bottom ground looked up from his coffee to a sky gone hazy and wrong, and a sound under the heat like frying fat, and walked out to find the air over his wheat glittering and moving. The hoppers up off the draws in a body at last, and coming across his field in a wave that ate the light as it came. Where they lit, the wheat went. Not nibbled, gone. The head stripped, and the leaves gone, and the stems cut off ragged, a standing crop reduced to bare gray rows in the space of an afternoon, and the wave lifting again with a dry roar of wings to fall on the next field over. It went down the valley like fire without smoke. The Halvorsen wheat went in a day. The bottom pieces Cyrus Dwight was proudest of went in too. Field after field of the best dry land wheat in the country went gray and bare to the calichet. A whole year's work and a whole year's bread eaten off the stalk, while the men who had grown it stood at their fences with their hats in their hands and nothing on God's earth to do about it. The fear changed the way the valley moved. Men who had burned a lazy strip of bran along their margins were out at first light now dragging poison across whole fields and plowing green fire breaks of bare dirt they hoped the hoppers would not cross, and beating at the edges of the last standing pieces with wet sacks like men fighting a grass fire, and it did no good. Because you cannot beat back a plague with a wet sack any more than you can burn a whole valley. They watched their wheat go and did the sums no farmer wants to do, of a note at the bank and a bin standing empty and a winter coming, and the talk at the elevator that had been so easy all summer went out of the men entirely. Because there is no laughing left in a country where the crop is going gray in the field and the draws are still boiling. The valley had spent a laughing summer certain it knew what was worth keeping and what was worthless. It was learning, in the worst way there is, that it had had the whole thing backward. The county sent out a man from the extension office, and the extension man stood on the elevator platform and told a crowd of ruined farmers what by then they had already begun, with a dawning horror to understand, that the hatch had gotten away from them in the draws in the dry spring, that the poison had gone on too little and too late, and that once a plague was up and moving in a body like this one there was no bran, and no fire break, and no machine that would turn it, that they would lose what was still standing and could only hope to knock down the next hatch harder come another year. A man in the crowd asked him, in the flat, hopeless voice of a man who already knows the answer, whether there was anything on earth that would actually hold a field through a year like this one. And the extension man spread his hands and said that, short of a hard early frost, he knew of nothing quick, that a plague this size simply had to be endured. There was no field in that valley, he said, a man could count on now. No field, that is, but one, though the extension man did not know it, and it would fall to an old hired hand with a bulging crawled bird in his hands to say so. It was Cyrus Dwight's own old hired man, a leathery hand named Emmett Cross, who had worked the country 40 years and forgotten more dry land farming than most men learn, who said it first, and he said it standing at the elevator with a dead hopper-fat turkey hen in his two hands, one that had strayed onto the road and been hit and his hat pushed back. He said he'd cut the craw of it open out of pure curiosity there in the ditch, and that it was packed to bursting with grasshoppers and nothing else, not a kernel of grain in it, and that he'd driven the Renfrew line that same morning to move astray and looked over the widow's fence at the one thing no man in that valley had seen in a week. Standing wheat, green standing wheat, headed and filling, clean to the fence, in the middle of a valley, eaten to the dirt. The men around him went quiet, and Emmett Cross, who was too old and too tired to care much for elevator laughter, said the thing none of the rest of them had let themselves think yet. He said, "It's them birds. It's them gobbling birds of hers. They've been eating the hoppers off that ground all summer while we burned bran and cursed the weather, and hers is the only field left standing in this whole valley, and every one of us laughed at her for it." No one laughed then. There is a particular silence that falls on a crowd of proud men when they understand all at once that the person they have been mocking was right. And it fell on the elevator platform that afternoon, and it did not lift. They stood there with their empty bins and their gray fields and their notes coming due, and they understood that the widow Renfrew, whom they had counted a fool, had spent the whole laughing summer doing the one thing that would have carried them all through, and that not a man among them had troubled once to ask her why. Some of them, standing there, would have been remembering their own words, the plucker come November, the walking Thanksgiving, the hogs a person of sense would keep instead, and finding those words gone suddenly bitter in the mouth. It is one thing to be wrong. It is another to have laughed at the one who was right while your own crop went gray in the field. And there is no man harder on a proud man in that moment than himself. They stood in the long silence, and they did the sum of it, every one of them, and not a word was said that a person would want to remember. Cyrus Dwight said nothing at all. He stood a while at the edge of the crowd with his jaw working, a big, proud man who had run the valley's opinions for 30 years and had just heard his own hired man name him, in front of everyone, the loudest of the fools. Then he got in his truck and he drove. And where he drove, though it cost him more than he could have said to do it, was out off his ruined bottom ground to the dry end of the valley, to the thin caliche quarter section where the gobbling carried on the wind, to the fence of the woman he had offered to buy out twice and mocked a dozen times, to ask her, hat in his hands, for help. Alta was at the shed lot when his truck turned in, and she heard the birds tell her he was coming before she saw the dust, the hard, sudden swell of them going up along the road as they always did for a stranger's truck, and she stood and waited by the fence with the feed bucket still in her hand. Cyrus Dwight got out slow. He was a big man and a proud one, and he did not have the first idea how to do what he had come to do, and he stood at her fence a long moment looking out over her clean green standing wheat with the coppery drove working the edges of it in the low gold light, at a thing no other man in the valley had to look at any more, and at last he took off his hat, which the valley had never once seen Cyrus Dwight do at a fence, and he said he reckoned she'd seen what the hoppers had done. Alta said she had. He said Emmett allowed her wheat was standing clean. She said it was. It had been all summer. And Cyrus Dwight looked at his hat in his hands, and he said, in a voice gone low and rough, that he'd been wrong about her birds, and that he was sorry for the way he'd talked, and that he was cleaned out for the year with a note at the bank and a family to carry. And could she, tell him how a man went about getting a drove of his own onto his ground before another season took him under? She did not gloat. That was the thing the valley would remember about Alta Renfrew long after the hopper summer had passed into an old story told at the elevator, that when the turning came, and it came all the way, she took not 1 ounce of pleasure in it. She had every right in the world to stand at that fence and let Cyrus Dwight feel the full weight of every word he had ever said on that platform. And she did not. She looked at the big, proud man turning his hat in his hands, and she thought, if she thought anything, of empty bins and a hard winter, and she said only that poults took patience and a full year to raise up to any use, but that she had a broody hen or two she could spare and eggs enough to set him a start, and that she'd help him get a drove going and show him how to hold it to his fields, and that he'd want to run them on the draws first thing come spring before the hatch got up. She named him a fair price for the setting eggs, the same she'd have named anyone, and not a dollar of grudge in it. And Cyrus Dwight, who had told the whole elevator to run her, drove through the plucker, stood at the widow's fence and thanked her, and meant it, and drove home with a setting of eggs on the seat beside him wrapped in a feed sack. He was the first, and then they came. The Halvorsons came, wiped out to the fence line, and Alta gave them a start of poults and would not take a dollar for it, not from a family with an empty bin and a winter coming. The families off the section road came. The old hand Emmett Cross came on his own account, embarrassed and grinning, and said he'd wanted a turkey drove for 30 years and been too proud to keep one, and Alta gave him a setting of eggs and told him he was a fool for waiting, and it was the closest thing to a joke the valley ever heard her make. Through the rest of that terrible summer and into the fall, the trucks came out the section road to the dry end of the valley one after another, to the fence of the woman they had laughed at, to buy her poults and beg her eggs and take her hard-won advice, and to look, most of them, at the one green field left in the country and understand at last what they had been laughing at. She sold what she could sell and gave away what needed giving, and she showed every one of them the same thing, patient and plain, how to raise a poult up through its foolish weeks, how to hold a drove to the fields, how to read the gobbling for the watch bell it was, and how to have the birds on the draws in the spring before ever the hatch got up. She had been the most laughed-at woman in the valley in June. By October, she was the reason half of them believed they'd have a crop the next year at all. The plague passed, the way these things pass, when the September nights turned hard and a killing frost came down out of a clear sky and knocked the hoppers dead in the grass overnight. The valley counted its losses and found them heavy, a year's wheat gone off most of the good ground, bins standing empty into a lean winter, more than one family carried only by the bank's patience and a neighbor's start of birds. It could have finished some of them, and everyone knew, without much wanting to say it, the one place the plague had not touched at all, and why. And in the years that followed, a strange and quiet thing settled over the Dry Cedar country. It became, of all the unlikely things, turkey country. The gobbling that had once carried on the wind as a foolish woman's folly now rolled up from a dozen places at once, from the bottom ground and the section road and the Halvorson place and Cyrus Dwight's own home fields. The loose, rolling racket rising off drove after drove across the valley every dry spring when the birds went out on the draws, and no one laughed at it any more. They had learned the hard way to hear it the way Alta had always heard it, not as 100 greedy mouths, but as work being done, and as bread in the bin, and as an army standing between a field and a thing in the draws that could eat a year in an afternoon. Alta Renfrew never once threw it back at them, and that in the end, was what made the valley take her in the way it had never taken a widow alone before. She could have. She had stood on that platform and taken their laughter for 4 long years, and when the turning came she could have collected on every word of it, and she never did. She sold Cyrus Dwight his eggs fair and gave the wiped-out families their poults for nothing, and taught anyone who asked. And she never said, not once, that she had told them so. Because she had not told them so, she had simply known and worked, and let the ground and the birds and the terrible summer say it for her. When a young couple new to the country asked her, a year on, why she'd kept those birds when the whole valley laughed, she only said that she'd watched a drove hold the hoppers off her husband's oats years before ever the plague came, and that a thing you have seen with your own eyes is worth more than a platform full of men who are sure. And then she went back to her fencing, because the frost had killed the hoppers, but the dry draws would hatch them again next dry year, and the drove still had to be raised and held and counted in every night. And a woman who has been proven right does not get to skip the evening's work any more than a woman who has been laughed at does. They had said her birds were greedy in the dry summer of 1954, and in a way they were right. Greedy for hoppers, greedy for the beetle and the grub and the cutworm, greedy from first light to dark, the way a thing is greedy that has been made to eat a plague. What Alta Renfrew had understood, that none of them had troubled to ask, was that the worth of a turkey was never only in the meat come November. It was in the work and the watch and the endless gobbling patrol of 117 tireless mouths stripping a danger off the ground before it could ever rise up in a body and eat a valley's bread, a worth that did not show at the elevator scale and could not be laughed at once you had seen what its absence cost. The greediest, gawkiest, most wasteful-seeming thing on her whole place had turned out to be the thing that saved the harvest, and she had known it all along, and she had never needed them to know it, only to be fed. As the old freighter Orrin Buckle had told her husband years before, in the shade of a half-raised barn, the hungriest mouth on the place is not always the wasteful one. Sometimes it is the only thing standing between you and the year the sky comes down. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told that what they have isn't worth keeping. Drop your city in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, ask yourself this: how many of the loud, greedy, inconvenient things we are all so quick to be rid of are the very things quietly keeping us fed?